Texas is suing the federal government because it keeps ripping down the razor wire fencing that Texas sets up around its border.
Every time I look at the border, the legal issues get weirder. It all started a few years ago when Texas spent millions of dollars putting wire fencing like this along parts of its border. The goal was to stop the influx of migrants into the state.
But federal border agents have recently been destroying the wire fencing, using wire cutters and even forklifts and allowing migrants to pass through to be processed. The lawsuit alleges that federal agents even construct rope systems to allow migrants to get up steep areas of the border.
So can Texas put up this kind of razor wire, and can the federal government tear it down?
Well, Texas cannot construct any border on federal land, but Texas says that all the wire that's been put up has been on state land or on private land with the owner's permission. So it's legal?
Maybe, but maybe not. The reality is this issue isn't legally clear because it's a totally new thing for states to try to create their own border structures, and there isn't any clear case law yet.
Typically, it's primarily the domain of the federal government to control the borders and immigration, but states have their own powers too. We almost guarantee that in the near future, the Supreme Court will be asked to decide whether states can create their own borders.
But for now, Texas says that the federal government is illegally destroying property that isn't there. And so far, Texas has won what's called the temporary restraining order, meaning a federal judge has told the feds that they have to temporarily stop their wire cutting, except in the case of medical emergencies, until the case is fully decided.
The feds, for their part, have defended the wire cutting mostly by pointing to medical and safety issues, because there have been some reports of migrants getting injured in the wiring.
Overall, the main point of the feds seems to be to let people pass through safely and be processed through the legal system without injury. But this case and the whole larger legal issue is just beginning.
Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib has officially been censured over her comments about Israel. What does that mean?
Nobody actually knows.
I do. So this all started when Tlaib took to Twitter or X or whatever the hell you call it, and made posts which many in Congress say promote false narratives and call for the destruction of Israel.
In particular, Congress members pointed to her post blaming Israel for bombing a hospital in Gaza and killing 500 people, even though the Pentagon says the blast was most likely caused by a misfired Hamas rocket. The post actually still remains on Twitter, although it's been community noted as misinformation.
Congress members also pointed to another post of hers which included this chant.
So what actually happens when someone's censured?
Nothing at all. It's just kind of an official scolding, where a majority of Congress basically votes to say we don't like what you did. But there's no real penalty and it doesn't change their job in any way.
Sometimes when someone's censured, they literally have to stand in front of all their colleagues while the reason for the censure is read aloud to them, basically to embarrass them. But Tlaib wasn't required to do this.
Censures lately have become pretty political and votes usually fall along party lines. But here, 22 fellow Democrats voted in favor of censuring Tlaib. Supporters of Tlaib have accused Congress of racism, saying they're singling out Tlaib, who's the only Congress member of Palestinian descent, and deliberately distorting her viewpoints, which they believe involve fair criticisms of the Israeli government but not of Jewish people themselves. Their ability to make a right on red might be coming to an end.
Yeah, if they pry it from my cold dead hands.
Many Americans don't know this, but most countries don't allow making a right on red.
In the US, the practice all started back in the 1970s, when there was a huge energy crisis and the government thought that allowing cars to make a right on red would save fuel costs by preventing unnecessary idling.
In fact, back then the federal government actually forced all states to allow right on red if they wanted to continue to receive federal road funding. But over the last few decades, that's been changing. In New York, for example, right on red is already generally illegal. And DC City Council's actually already passed a right on red ban that will go into effect in 2025. Now, politicians in all of these cities are considering doing the same. Those in favor of the ban say that drivers today are more distracted than ever, making the practice more dangerous than necessary. They point to studies showing that the number of roadway deaths are increasing, particularly for pedestrians and cyclists, and that making a right on red doesn't actually save enough energy to justify the danger.
On the other hand, those wanting to keep the right on red say that it won't just inconvenience drivers but slow down business and delivery trucks, particularly in times when traffic is worse than ever. Some are even claiming that it's part of a movement to make driving as miserable and difficult as possible so people will drive less.
Do you know that the police can legally lie to you to get you to confess? And they can lie about almost anything.
We already got the warrant for your house. We found everything. Fingerprints are all over the scene of the crime. Your accomplice? He told us everything.
Including all of that.
That's too stupid. But the Seattle Police Department is now the first in the nation to adopt a new policy limiting this kind of deception. The policy changes in response to a case from 2018 where a man committed a hit and run. During the investigation, police said that the person the man had hit with his car was in critical condition and nearly dead, when in reality there were no injuries at all.
The man later took his own life, and his family said that it was due, at least in part, to the stress that he felt over seriously injuring someone.
To be clear here though, and some headlines have got this kind of wrong, the new policy doesn't ban Seattle police from lying, it just limits it.
The policy is kind of confusing, but put simply, the police can no longer lie about something that would shock the conscience.
If that sounds vague, it's because it's supposed to be. This legal lingo means that police can still lie in situations that they can argue are reasonable.
One last point here, police in most states can actually even lie to juveniles.
Which is even more controversial given that neuroscience has shown that juvenile brains are way more susceptible to deception, and they're more likely to give false confessions. Do it? Did we save the daylight? Is it safe?
As you already know, daylight saving time, there is no S, just ended. We set our clocks back to standard time, and now it gets dark at freaking 5 p.m.
But there's a chance we never have to do this again. As Senator Marco Rubio says, changing your clocks twice a year is stupid. Pithy.
Which is why he's consistently tried to pass the Sunshine Protection Act. The act would make daylight saving time, the one with more light in the evening, the permanent time throughout the U.S. No more changing the clock.
Last year, the act actually unanimously passed through the Senate, but ultimately stalled in the House and never passed. Reports say the House didn't want to deal with it, with some representatives saying they had better things to do. You could do two things at once!
But it also didn't pass due to controversy over which schedule should be the permanent one. Standard time, lighter in the mornings, or daylight saving time, lighter in the evening.
Polls show that the majority of the U.S. wants to stop changing the time back and forth, and many medical professionals also agree that it's bad for our health. But there's much more debate over which time schedule should actually win. Some studies show that more light in the evening leads to less crime, less depression, and less energy consumption. Whereas the American Academy for Sleep Medicine says our bodies are actually better suited for lighter mornings and darker evenings. And then there's also the children.
If daylight saving time is permanent, that means it would be dark in the mornings during the winter, meaning kids would be headed to school in the morning in the dark. But that also means they have to come home from work in the dark.
Interestingly, federal law does allow states to refuse to change their clocks, but only if they choose daylight saving time as the permanent time, which is exactly what Arizona's done.
The Sunshine Protection Act was reintroduced again this year, so we'll see what happens this time.
ACLU is suing the state of Tennessee over its aggravated prostitution law, which imposes harsher punishments on people with HIV, and therefore, they say, disproportionately affects black and transgender women.
Oh boy. So Tennessee treats general prostitution as a misdemeanor, but the aggravated prostitution law makes it a felony to engage in sex work if you know you have HIV. The law also requires a lifetime registration as a sex offender if convicted.
The ACLU says the law violates the ADA, so does it? Well, the ADA prohibits any discrimination based on a protected disability, and what counts as a protected disability is actually quite broad and does include HIV.
So open and shut case? Not really. 21 other states actually also have laws that explicitly criminalize knowingly spreading HIV. This man in Florida made news a few years ago for knowingly spreading HIV to several people, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for it. But how do these laws exist if the ADA says that HIV is a protected disability?
This is a tricky topic, but to put it really briefly, the government can discriminate against a protected disability as long as it has a really valid reason for doing it.
Think of it this way. The military can discriminate against blind people when it comes to selecting fighter pilots, because there's a very valid reason to want pilots who can see.
And when it comes to Tennessee's aggravated prostitution law, the state would say that its very valid reason is to stop the spread of HIV.
But in their lawsuit, the ACLU disagrees. They say that HIV is no longer the death sentence that it was in the early 90s when this law was first passed, and that proper antiviral treatment can now prevent people with HIV from spreading it, meaning that there's no longer a valid reason to discriminate against people with HIV.
Ultimately, this is a question for a federal court to decide, and it's entirely possible this super divisive issue could work its way all the way up to the Supreme Court.